Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Ending Homelessness in Australia, two Churchill Fellows perspectives. My name is Tiffany Connolly. I am a program coordinator at IGH. Thank you for being here, especially considering the different time zones. I know it's very early, very late for some of you, so thank you for being here. I have a few housekeeping items that I want to share with you all. First, I want to just acknowledge the time change of the webinar in honor of Indigenous Australians' call for a week of silence following the vote of the rejection to recognize them within the Australians' Constitution. We postponed this webinar. We stand in full solidarity with Indigenous Australians, and we thank everyone for your flexibility in joining us today. We also want to acknowledge the land that IGH is on, which is the Council of the Three Fires, which is a Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chippewa lands. A few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded to be shared in follow-up communications. As you join, please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. There is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen that you can use to submit questions that you have for the panel. We have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations where we can share those questions and the panel can answer. And you can continue to use the chat to converse with one another, and we just ask that you just remain thoughtful and respectful as you converse in the chat. And lastly, oh, sorry, it's not letting me switch my slides, but lastly, connect with IGH and the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness on social media. As you engage with the webinar, we're on Twitter. I think both organizations are on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So we encourage you to connect via those platforms. Now I will turn it over to Allan Big Al Connolly, who will help moderate for us today.
Well, thank you very much, Tiffany, for that wonderful introduction. I too would like to acknowledge and pay tribute to the Noongar Whadjuk people and their elders past and present, the traditional custodians of the land budget on which we work in Western Australia. This acknowledgement also accepts the invitation in the Uluru Statement from the Heart to walk together with First Peoples nations across Australia in a movement of the Australian people, and I voted yes. And I'd like to acknowledge that my Australian colleagues are joining in the webinar from their own lands, and all of you globally for being here, and you know, your First Nations people as well. So it's been my wonderful honour to be able to be the moderator for this panel this morning. My two esteemed colleagues, Leanne Mitchell and David Pearson. A little bit of background from me is I am the co-chair for the WA Alliance to End Homelessness, and I have lived experience. So, you know, we are working closely with our organisations in Australia to embed lived experience into the sector, into government, to make sure that they can run a lens and hopefully work with you, your organisations, and the policymakers to affect that change that needs to happen if we are to truly make bigger strides to end homelessness. And ending homelessness now is not just a theory, it's been proven, and it continues to be proven. And, you know, that can only come about with concerted effort. And the fact that Leanne and David, with their fellowships, have been able to travel the world to look at certain strategies, to look at, you know, certain policies, and to bring that back in a report that they're both going to release to you online today. If you go to the Churchill website, you will see all of their links there, and you can connect with them on their fellowship journey as well. So please do visit the Churchill website. But to start with, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction of David from that Churchill Trust website, where he says there are a growing number of communities around the world that are not just reducing, but in many instances ending rough sleeping homelessness. Using data, these communities have changed how local homeless systems work and the impact they achieve. In the USA, 12 communities have ended homelessness for a population group by reaching a standard called functional zero. More than half of those communities have achieved reduction in the number of people experiencing chronic and/or veterans homelessness. He used his fellowship to better understand in detail how these and other communities are doing this, and set out his thoughts on how this approach can be effectively implemented in Australia. Then we have Leanne, who will follow David. Leanne's role is more around what local government can do to end homelessness, while simply geographically places local government at the front line of homelessness response. Councils and their workers often do not know what to do. More often than not, they are torn by conflicting responsibilities to their communities, face limited access to funds, and lack the mandate to take action. Leanne undertook the Jack Brockhoff Churchill Fellowship to investigate local government responses to homelessness. And Leanne's report, Everybody's Business, is based on research and interviews completed in the UK, US, and Canada, and exploring the innovative local government approaches to tackle homelessness. So I'd like to welcome David to share his presentation, and I look forward to answering some of your questions, which you can put in the question, or you can put them in the chat, and we'll answer them towards the end of the presentation. So thank you, David, if you'd like to bring up your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Al. Thank you, Tiffany. It's great to be here. Thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this and helping launch my report and share the insights from both mine and Leanne's reports. So can I also acknowledge I'm on Kaurna country today here in Adelaide, pay my respects. So I'm just going to take you through a little bit about what I learned, but I know that there's a very diverse group of people on the call today. So I just might start with asking a bit of background, and I wanted to just start by asking for people to think about a moment where they might have seen someone experiencing homelessness, generally in the street or in the community, and what you might have done. And I think one of the things that made me want to undertake this Churchill Fellowship was a recognition that so often we walk past people every day in our everyday lives who are experiencing often their worst moments in their life, and sleeping in the public domain. And the person on screen at the moment is Jack, or not his real name, but there'll be someone like Jack in almost every community for which everyone on this call is here today, whether we're in Australia or around the world. And everyone's story is different. And Jack's story began in his childhood with trauma. And that trauma led to drug and alcohol use, it led to mental health challenges. And at different points in time, Jack experienced homelessness of different forms, and then was provided housing but didn't have access to the support that he needed to sustain that housing, and so went back into homelessness. At other times, Jack was able to get access to the mental health support that he might need, or the rehab support, but then the housing wasn't available. And getting these things to line up, this is a common story around the world and in my hometown of Adelaide, where I met Jack. And this, in Australia, I just thought I might take through for the international visitors a little bit of context. So in Australia, we don't really measure how much homelessness there is. We estimate it every 5 years in our census. So the last census came out in 2021, and it estimated how many people were experiencing homelessness on that one given night. And I ask you to think about how would we manage a problem like unemployment or inflation if we manage that by estimating it every 5 years. That's the best we do in Australia. And it breaks down the numbers here, as you can see. And the type of homelessness that I was just talking about, Jack, before that, people on the street, it is a smaller subset of the overall homelessness, but anyone who has lived experience will show that these categories are useful for measurement, but as a real day, every life kind of experience, they're almost meaningless because people move in and out of these concepts, these categories of homelessness every other day. So out of that group of people that are experiencing rough sleeping homelessness at any point in time in Australia, we estimated as Australian Alliance that about 80% of those experience homelessness like Jack, that they have a chronic experience of ongoing homelessness. Out of that, we've estimated that about 424 people die each year, because we know that just one night's experience of homelessness can be catastrophic for your health. But again, we don't measure and we don't know. What we do measure and what we do know is that this situation is not just morally unacceptable, it's also economically makes no sense. It's actually more expensive, $13,000 more expensive to leave this problem unaddressed than it is to provide people like Jack with the housing and the support they need. So it's more expensive for us as taxpayers not to solve this problem. We could save $85 million just this year in Australia if we provided the housing and support for people like Jack, who we know are sleeping on the streets and dying up to 30 years younger than those of us with stable housing and support. So if you're not depressed and frustrated enough, don't worry. The mission that we've got as the Australian Alliance, the organisation that I lead, that led me to want to undertake this Churchill Fellowship, is to put a stop to that, is to say that we can end homelessness, we can prevent it, we can reduce it, and we can end it by making it rare, brief and non-recurring. And I'll talk a little bit more about that during the presentation today. And I'm really privileged to say that the knowledge that I'm sharing today hasn't just come from the Churchill Fellowship that I undertook and travelling around the world. It's also from this amazing group of organisation and people and communities that are part of what we call the Advance to Zero campaign in Australia. So there's nearly 30 communities who are part of this movement and seek to demonstrate that ending homelessness is possible every day. And just really briefly, as I mentioned, there's nearly 30 that are doing it. They collect data, 15 of them collect real-time data to address that lack of awareness and understanding of how much homelessness there is, so we can actually properly manage this. Out of those, 3 of those communities have achieved what's called a shift reduction. So that's a statistically significant change in the overall amount of homelessness that exists in their community. And they've been able to show reductions for 5 months in a row for their community. We also have another 3 communities that are what we call the home stretch. So those communities are getting closer and closer. They're very close to that goal of making homelessness rare, brief, and a one-time thing for a particular group of people in a particular place. And through this campaign, over the last number of years since we launched it, we've supported 3,255 people into homes. So I think that's just a bit of background on the Australian Alliance, the Advance to Zero campaign that led me to undertake this Churchill Fellowship. But the beginnings of this fellowship for me started back in about 2017. I don't remember if those who are on the call might remember from Australia, that time when the Lord Mayor of Melbourne was seeking to criminalise homelessness essentially, and that they had large-scale campouts in Sydney in one of our biggest kind of retail areas. And at the same time that was happening, the first communities in the United States were ending homelessness. So that's what set me on this journey to say, can we go down this path on the left and can we learn more about that? And so that's essentially what my Churchill Fellowship set out to do, as Al was talking about earlier. And what I want to run you through today is just a bit of background on the Churchill Fellowship, some key insights that ending homelessness requires a strategy, what the theory of change or framework that we've developed based on all of the lessons from Australia and my Churchill Fellowship looks like today. A little bit of a case study on housing first and ending homelessness. This is an issue that sort of I've not fully appreciated and understood until taking this fellowship, and keen to share that out today. And just a key conclusion, some recommendations for action. So that's the sort of quick agenda for me. So this is my Churchill Fellowship. I went to these different countries, these different cities. So it's 12 cities and 6 countries over 8 weeks. It was exhausting, split into 2 pits, but it was an incredible experience. And the kind of key lessons that I learned through that process were essentially each country is very different. And I know a lot of people raised with me, and many of the people on this call said, why are you going to America? Why are you going to the United States to learn about homelessness? Surely there's not a lot we can learn from them. Why aren't you going to Finland? And I said, well, I am going to Finland, and I'll talk about Finland in a minute. But the United States has ended homelessness for particular communities, for particular types of homelessness. No other community had done that until they had. And it really, for me, I think, exemplified this idea that ending homelessness is possible. And they did it by breaking the problem up, by using proof points, those kind of demonstrations that I showed you earlier from what we've achieved in Australia, to demonstrate that you're making progress, even in a housing crisis that we face in Australia and many parts of the world right now, that you can make progress, and you can use that progress to create momentum, to create more progress, rather than just be locked into the cycle of despair and despondency that increasing and the different challenge of homelessness has. So that was the sort of first kind of key lesson, and why I wanted to undertake this visit. And it was incredible to just go and spend time with some of the communities that have done that. The other kind of key lesson from the United States is that their health system is just so inequitable compared to Australia. But as a consequence, it acts so much more as the sort of the homelessness system and the health system are integrated in a way that provide that sort of social safety net that just doesn't happen in Australia. The health system and the homelessness system may as well be oil and water. They hardly talk to each other, and we need to do so much more to make them better integrate, particularly if we're to address that challenge of that 424 people that I mentioned earlier that we estimate die, often from preventable illnesses, if they were able to access the healthcare they needed and the housing they need to sustain their healthcare. And then finally, the improvement work, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later, but that's the three kind of key lessons from the United States. But probably the biggest one was actually drawn out of not failure, but just what they were seeking to do through a thing called the 100,000 Homes campaign. Was their first large-scale change, well, not the first, but one of the biggest large-scale change efforts they had to try and end homelessness. And many of you might have heard this story before about how they sought to house 100,000 people and use that as a sort of way to demonstrate that ending homelessness is possible. But when the data came out, and they do measure homelessness every year in the United States, they'd only reduced homelessness by 30,000. So 100,000 new properties in, but homelessness only reduced by 30,000. And they realized that fundamentally they were counting the wrong way. Rather than counting up to the goal of housing people, we need to count down to the goal of ending homelessness. And to do that, you need to break up the problem. Focus in a place, focus on a group of people like Jack or people like veterans or that kind of thing. And that's what they've done. And they've now got 14 communities that have ended homelessness, a little bit more than what my Churchill fellowship said from the text you were reading before, Al. And then the next country I visited was Canada. And they've now got 4 communities that have ended homelessness as well for particular groups. They're doing for either veterans and chronic as well. And there's a range of lessons from Canada. I think one of the things that really struck me was that how much they're talking about the racism in the system and the need for reconciliation. And anyone in Australia, and given Tiffany's acknowledgement of the outcome of the referendum we recently had, shows that we've got a lot of work to do in that space in Australia, and that any work to end homelessness needs to really grapple with those issues of racism and reconciliation, particularly in Australia. Another kind of key lesson for me from there was that Canadians are often known as being polite. And I'm in fact married to a Canadian, and they are very polite, but they also were really, really clear about when conversations and being polite is just not enough, and that you need to have better meetings and better coordination if you want to end homelessness. And that often, a lot of the time, what we think we're doing when we're collaborating is we're just being collegial. And actually what we need to do is align our effort and change our strategies. And so there's some really interesting insights from Canada about that and the role of collective impact initiatives that I talk a lot more about in my report. And the last thing was a little word of caution from them around the United States as well, that whilst the United States has got these proof points and that they talk about ending homelessness a lot in the United States that we very rarely talk about in Australia, that milestones are important, but really if we're going to make meaningful large-scale change, we need to really strap in for a long-term journey on this work, that it's not going to happen quickly, and that we need to plan for the long term while seeking to get those short-term proof points. So I thought that was really interesting. The next place I visited was the United Kingdom, which is a very mixed bag. The United Kingdom is, Scotland and England were the two sort of parts of the UK that I went to. And chalk and cheese, really. Like when I was in London, the amount of homelessness there was phenomenal. You just couldn't move without seeing people experiencing just the worst kind of poverty in the public domain, but also, you know, being a bit jet lagged when I was there, walking around in London late at night, there was people everywhere. It was very confronting, and they have made progress in the past. But Scotland, on the other hand, had done really well. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But this room that you can see with the table with the blue kind of skylight above, that was their sort of case conferencing table and their outreach table. And they're all based around that table. And when they look up, the sky's the limit is the idea there. And that table has been central to them driving reductions in Glasgow down to essentially rare, brief and non-reoccurring. The other things that I think really stood out of the UK was prevention. There just needs to be so much more focus on preventing homelessness. If you want to end homelessness, the best way to do it is stop it from ever occurring. And there's plenty of things that we need to do better about that in Australia. The person-centered nature of their work was really impressive, and there's a bit of a slide here from Mayday Trust that were really important. And then the integration of employment and social enterprise into the efforts of ending homelessness was really impressive too there, and there's a lot of reflections in my report about that. And then the last country I visited was Finland, and everyone talks about Finland, and the Finns were so friendly and incredibly impressive. But honestly, it was a little bit disappointing, I have to say, visiting Finland. And the frankness of that is that there's not a huge amount we can just copy from what Finland's doing and implement that in our practice in Australia around homelessness policy. Because homelessness, what their success in Finland is not just about their homelessness policy, it's also about their economic policy and that the full strategy of their whole society, that you don't get to choose where your kids go to school in Finland because they believe in equality and the schools are equal. The tax rate in Finland is just vastly different to Australia and many other Western countries. So I honestly believe we should aim to be more like Finland in every part of our public policy and things. And that's where the leadership and the advocacy that they have is just incredible. But the other lessons for us to learn from there are definitely around housing first and system change, which I'll talk about, and permanent supportive housing. So this idea that we have housing with support. I'll talk a bit more about that in a tick too. But essentially, if I was to distill everything out of that Churchill Fellowship down into 4 things, it would be, if you want to end homelessness, have a strategy, be able to define what success is and measure that, work collaboratively and learn from others to do that, and commit and believe that ending homelessness is possible. They're the 4 things that I think, if I was to distill everything that I've learned about homelessness through the Churchill Fellowship and through my work with the Institute of Global Homelessness and the Australian Alliance, I'd say it's those 4 things. And even then, to distill it down even further, just for Australia, I would say this, and I sort of came across this quote when I came home and I was trying to not think about homelessness, and I was watching some crappy reality TV show, and this quote came up, and I'm like, that's essentially it. That summarizes what the problem in Australia is. We have lots of programs, we have lots of initiatives, but we have no strategy to end homelessness. We don't even have a declared goal to end homelessness in Australia. In fact, every country I visited on the Churchill Fellowship, all 8 of them, had a goal to make homelessness rare, brief, and a one-time thing. Prevented where possible, and then rare, brief, and one-time thing. In some form of language around that. Even the pretty conservative government in the UK at the moment is committed to that. And so Australia stands alone, not only in not having a policy on homelessness nationally, but not having a strategy to end homelessness. And so I'm hopeful that the strategy that the Albanese government is developing might help us to address that. So just quickly, what does a strategy look like? To have an aim, to seek to try and end homelessness, and there's a lot of work being done around definitions on that, to define it, so that rare, brief and non-recurring thing I was talking about, to measure it, functional zero, that's Al mentioned before, and to have a framework or a theory of change, which I'll run through as well. And then finally, to implement that in a way that which people can engage. So having a strategy, where does it start? Well, it starts with recognizing that it's actually someone's job. And it's actually no one's job in the system at the moment to end homelessness. It's everyone's job, and as a consequence, it ends up being no one's job. And so I sort of mapped out, well, where does this fit? You know, what's the role of the Australian government and the Australian Alliance, the organisation that I lead? And in Australia, we have this love affair with homelessness, with housing and home ownership. And that is really important and it's great, but it also often distracts us from all the other parts of this homelessness and housing continuum. And so there's rental affordability and housing affordability, and rental rights is becoming more of an issue in Australia. And there's been some progress on that, but needs to be more. We're getting a little bit more attention on social housing, but essentially the gap in social housing that we have in Australia at the moment is nowhere near going to be met by the level of investment that's coming out of governments at the moment. And then you've got homelessness, and housing first is a key component of homelessness. But that housing first home and homelessness generally gets lost within your general housing, right? Generally, the argument is if you build more houses, you build more social houses, you will end homelessness. Well, we know that that doesn't work for some people, and that ending homelessness requires more than just houses. And so that's where this sort of focus on chronic homelessness is ending homelessness. It often just gets lost. And each as you go further along to the left of this continuum, it's just a less and less of a priority for governments, for community, and even understanding like what is chronic homelessness. It's not even defined in Australia. There's no official definition of what chronic homelessness is that is generally used and adopted. So I sort of planned out what's our role, the Australian Alliance and the Advance to Zero campaign in that, and also thinking about what is this difference between a specialist homelessness system, the agencies that are funded by the federal and state governments to deal with homelessness services, and what it actually takes to end homelessness. And there's a difference. This slide sets that out, and it says that this isn't a problem that any one agency, any one group of agencies can solve that are just in the specialist homelessness system. It has to be about a whole of society, whole of government response to ending homelessness. So have a strategy to end homelessness, then have a definition. And many of you have heard about this rare, brief and non-rare explanation. I thought I'd just express that in a slightly different way to be a bit more memorable, because I talk about it all the time. But some people this is quite new to. So what we mean by ending homelessness is that we can prevent it wherever possible and make it rare, brief and once off. The next is to measure it. And that's this idea of functional zero. So functional zero is that you can make sure your housing system places more people into it and sustains that housing that are coming in. And this is where the idea of by name lists came from, and was really one of the key pioneering elements of what community solutions did in the US. It allows a smarter triage to support prevention and to drive advocacy. And the last thing that we've done a lot of work on in Australia, and I spent a lot of time thinking about during my fellowship, was this idea of, okay, so you've got an aim, you've got a definition, you've got a measure. Now what? How do you implement it? What's your theory of change? And so a theory of change is how are the things that we're going to do going to add up to an end to homelessness? And if we work back from the goal of ending homelessness, as that 100,000 homes campaign example shows that we really need to do, what is the things that are going to add up to helping us end homelessness? So first of all, have that aim, as we talked about before. And then because homelessness is this complex problem that's constantly changing, there's no one solution that's going to solve this. So we need a whole bunch of collaborative approaches that works across whole of society, whole of government. Of course, it needs housing first. It needs that person-centered sort of strengths-based stuff that I was talking about from the UK. It needs data and improvement and working in a place, breaking this problem up. And then a whole series of activities, prevention, outreach, by name lists, coordinated services. There's a lot more information about all of these elements in the report, and that we, as the Australian Alliance, have been working on and learning from our international colleagues from many years. Just to highlight one of those, the sort of improvement element of this. The improvement element is what we've been trying to do is implement that through improvement cycles, I should say. And what we mean by that is sort of 6 monthly cycles of trying to get people to change whatever they can within the realm of what they can control. And one lesson that I've really learned in the last little while is that improvement is not about doing this. It's not about just squeezing the existing lemon harder and hoping you get more and more out of the existing system. It's not even about slicing up the existing system more and more smaller, and you just eventually, this is a theory of change, won't work. You're just squeezing the lemon too hard. You'll eventually run out of salami. You'll burn your workforce out, all those sorts of things. And that's essentially what improvement's about. It's saying, let's focus on the things that we can create change and leverage changes to our system. And many of you might be familiar with this slide that we use a lot in Australia. And we implement that through breaking the problem up, small improvement cycles. So in Australia, through the Advance to Zero campaign, we use 6 monthly improvement cycles, which is learned from the United States and the Canadians and others that are doing this around the world now as well. And we use this improvement methodology that they've adopted from other human services areas. So what is involved with that in a really practical sense? Well, essentially it starts with come up with a plan for your local community about what does it take to end homelessness, what we call an action plan. Create real-time data, use that data to drive improvements and proof points, and then sustain that improvement and keep working and expand that to other communities. And these are the different proof points that we've kind of developed for Australia and that I've tweaked based on the Churchill Fellowship and in consultation with some of the large-scale change leaders in Australia. And so that falls in that last bit of this slide, which is the improvement cycles. So just to really be clear on it, there's a strategy, there's approaches, there's a methodology around some elements of this, there's improvement cycles, and all of that adds up to a theory of change about what it would take to end homelessness in Australia, based on what we already know and based on all the lessons and learnings from the Churchill Fellowship. So I know that's a lot, and there's a lot of more information in the report, and we're going to do a bit of work over the next year or so to share that out more in a digestible way to communities across Australia. But just to focus on one case study, as I mentioned before, Housing First, this is something that has been a bit of a challenge for me over the last little while to figure out what is the difference between Housing First and ending homelessness. And so essentially we're able to map this out with Leah Watkins, a colleague of mine, and to understand what are the different details, what are the different things we mean by Housing First. So there's obviously the Housing First principle or the approach, and that is the idea that we provide housing without conditions. So this isn't that you need to get your drug and alcohol problem under control before we give you a housing option. It's like, well, you can't solve your drug and alcohol problem until you've got housing or mental health or whatever else it might be, so that we make sure that housing is the first step. That should be the general principle. In Australia, and we often talk about that as a sort of compass, as a direction that we want to go. And in Australia, we've developed some principles. So the Homelessness Australia has developed those Housing First principles for what that approach looks like. Then there's programs, which we often get confused. There's Housing First programs, and this is where this idea of high fidelity comes in, where you've got a really clear understanding of what the program is and how it's helping people at an individual level. So it's not a system change intervention, it's program intervention. And that's much more of what we call a roadmap, that it's really specific about what you do and you follow those instructions. And then finally, you've got Housing First as a system change effort, which is really kind of getting a lot of traction and talk in Europe at the moment. And what the Finns would say was the approach that they really pioneered, and that is challenging for us to implement in Australia, given that we're not doing all the things that the Finns have in terms of the broader society and economic structures. But essentially, what I've learned is that a Housing First systems change effort is about ending homelessness. So the Advanced Zero campaign in Australia is a Housing First system change effort. It's essentially interchangeable. I haven't been able to, after talking to everyone around the world and mapping this out, they, to me, seem like the same thing. And so that also is a compass, right? It's not a specific set of things you must do. It's a goal, it's an aim that you work towards. And that's why the framework for Advanced to Zero rather than methodology is the language we sort of adopted, so that's descriptive rather than prescriptive. And then finally, the different elements you need in a Housing First system. Housing First does have crisis accommodation. A Housing First system needs crisis accommodation because you are not going to get every single person experiencing homelessness off the street and into permanent housing, their forever home, within 24 hours of meeting them. But that crisis accommodation should be short, it should be brief, and it should not be transitional accommodation. It shouldn't be that you stay here for a period of time and those sorts of things. So Housing First requires getting people into housing as quickly as possible and making it their sort of forever home. It also requires supportive housing. And I think sometimes there's been this debate in Australia, is supportive housing first, or, common ground and those sorts of things. And it absolutely is, if you're going by the principles of what Housing First is about. And then finally, the A to Z sort of framework that we sort of developed, it allows you to triage the scarce housing options you've got into the different types, and making sure that the type of housing you've got in your system can go to those who are most in need, and organise that and allocate that in a coordinated way. So your brain hurts after all of that, because I know I'm running through this very quickly. Essentially, we've run through all the things I said we'd run through, but I just wanted to finish on a couple of key conclusions. And that is that ending homelessness is possible. The one single thing that my Churchill Fellowship left me with is this realization that ending homelessness is possible. I'd learned about it beforehand, and I absolutely believe that, but I don't think that ending homelessness is possible with one single program, one single agency, one individual program, individual pill program, building policy, any of those sorts of things. It takes communities working together to say that this problem isn't something that we will walk past anymore. This is not something that we should accept in our community. And there are many, many things that we can all do to stop this from occurring. And so the Churchill Fellowship report sets out a whole bunch of recommendations for the federal government, for state and local governments, and the local government bit was really influenced by Leanne's work, and I'm very grateful for that. There's a whole big role for universities, for civil society, for business, for philanthropy, and for the Australian Alliance, the organisation I lead. And I put the community services sector last and the homelessness system last because they already do the heavy lifting on this problem, and they are overwhelmed and they are overworked and they are under-resourced. And there is much more that can be done there, of course. But if we are truly to end homelessness, it requires everyone else in society saying that we don't see this as acceptable and taking actions to support that group of people in our society that are there to help the people experiencing homelessness. And I'm really grateful that as part of the Churchill Fellowship, and the last thing I'd say about that is I would really appreciate your help in sharing the story about the actions that can be taken. So I'd encourage you to have a look at the actions section of the report, my report, and think about how you might be able to share that with your networks and the people that you're involved with. We'll be sharing the video from this report, from this launch today of my report and the discussion of Leanne's and the issues generally. But I would really encourage you to think about how you can share what those actions are. And the great thing about my role is that I get to work about how do we build a movement and how do we build an organisation that supports communities and organisations and governments to do that work every day. And these are different elements of our work. But finally, just to say, I think that the biggest challenge for society in seeking to end homelessness is that the propensity is there to walk past it, that we don't measure it and that we don't have a strategy. And so that is our biggest challenge as a society. And I think for the biggest challenges for those who are working in the homelessness sector is not believing that this problem is solvable, but it absolutely is. The thing that it will take, as Margaret Mead said once, is that a small group of people willing to put their shoulder to the wheel and work, what I would say, in an organised way to say that this shouldn't exist anymore. And the way in which I know that that is possible, that we can achieve an end to homelessness, is because I saw it on my fellowship. And one of the last communities, and the point that I'll finish on, is the city of Glasgow that I mentioned before, that had that roof with the skylight where the sky is possible. Glasgow is a city that's larger than my hometown of Adelaide, and they regularly have homelessness that is rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. And they've reached that kind of, and that their regular number of people from when I was there anyway was 10 people on the street of a city of 1.6 million. It doesn't mean they don't have poverty. It doesn't mean they don't have other forms of homelessness. They've got many other things they need to do. But in Australia, in Adelaide, my hometown, which is smaller, we have 123 people at that same point in time. So homelessness is solvable, but only if we make that the goal and we work towards it. Thank you. And now, luckily, I think it's my job to head over to Leanne to talk a bit more about her fellowship and the role that ending homelessness and local government can play.
Thanks so much, David. I'm just going to try and share my screen quickly. And I think I have frozen. There we go. Okay, great. David, it's so great to follow you here and provide a little bit of a support act for you as we talk about our efforts to end homelessness. And there's a lot to take out of what you had to say. So thanks for having me, everybody. I'd first like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I join you here today, and that's the Wurundjeri people. And I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And this beautiful work featuring the Wurundjeri totem Bunjil is in the Brimbank Community and Civic Centre where I work. So, and I'd like to thank my colleagues at Brimbank City Council for supporting me in doing this work, and of course the Winston Churchill Trust and the Jack Brockhoff Foundation for allowing me the opportunity to complete this really once in a lifetime opportunity to do a Churchill Fellowship. For those of you who aren't from Australia, I'm just going to start with a little positioning. So I'm in Melbourne, and that's the dot right down the bottom, dot right down the bottom of the map of Australia. And at the risk of alienating my colleagues from Adelaide and Perth and everywhere else, Melbourne's considered the cultural centre of Australia. We have great parks, beautiful buildings, laneways, excellent food, good coffee, great street art. But actually the story I'm going to tell you today starts right here. And I took this photo in 2016, and it's interesting to see that the starting point for David and I was pretty much the same situation. the situation that happened here in Melbourne. This is a spot under a rail bridge not far from our main Flinders Street train station. And in the summer of 2016, the number of unhoused people sleeping in the streets of inner city Melbourne grew rapidly. It was highly visible, and it literally happened over the period of a few weeks. And it was a real marked change and quite confronting for many people. And quite likely it was a result of many things that were building over many years. So rising house prices, rent increases, places of last resort closing, lower investment in public housing, changes to the mental health system. And I know this is not just an experience in Australia, we're seeing this in many places. But not long after all of this happened, a local newspaper started running a campaign to clean up the city. And it really led to community outrage. And many people really started looking to the council I worked for, the City of Melbourne, to do something. And we were absolutely inundated with complaints. And then the next summer, a group of people camped outside the Flinders Street station. And this was in January 2017, at the time of the Australian Open. And the complaints raised as the papers ran more and more stories. They were villainising people living on the streets, criticising the Lord Mayor, the Premier and the Police Chief for not taking action, and also shaming the city for the state it was in when international tourists were about to arrive for a major sporting event. And we were under a lot of political, community and media pressure. And at that time, Melbourne's council sought to update the local street laws to change how people could reside on inner city streets. And the council actually proposed to broaden a ban on camping, and that would allow the confiscation of excess goods and also introduce fines. Well, thankfully, the result was really strong public sentiment against the proposed changes, and the move was abandoned eventually. But the homelessness issue did split our community into camps. You had those who wanted to do something for the most marginalised people in our community, and those who wanted a safe, clean, accessible city above everything else. And really, from my perspective, what this experience showed us was that, homelessness is a deeply political issue, and it's about many things, people's welfare, of course, but also about the look and feel of a city, perceptions of safety, and community's identity. It also showed me that local government's not aligned internally when it comes to responding to homelessness. And then also, finally, the power of perception versus fact. So Australian councils actually have little power and funds to respond to homelessness, but in the public's eye, they hold the responsibility. So this situation really challenged me, both professionally and personally, and I really felt conflicted in my role as a local government homelessness worker. And I was really unsure about what we could do as municipal government workers to manage both the politics and then work with the wider community and, importantly, improve the lives and situations of people facing extreme hardship. And the truth is, there's not really that much written on this. In Australia, the local government doesn't have a defined role in this space and is really often seen as a secondary player. So with these questions in mind, I completed my Churchill Fellowship just a year ago in 2022, visiting the UK, US and Canada. And you can see on this slide my topic area and some of the amazing and generous people I met up with along the way. And I know a few of you on this call too, so welcome and thank you for joining. And I asked these experts in their areas about the roles that local government can play in homelessness prevention and response. And what I found was that while the scope of the problem and the systems of governance are quite different, our experiences as government workers addressing homelessness are not too dissimilar, no matter where you are. Many of the problems, the frustrations, and the blockages that we face in all different parts of the world are eerily alike, as are our hopes and motivations. In fact, many of the challenges that local government faces in responding to homelessness sits in the way we're organised and how we operate and for whom. So The scope of local government is wide. We deliver many different services to different people. Councils oversee community infrastructure and land use planning. They support businesses, keep an eye on the local economy, keep places vibrant and safe. We deliver community services like maternal and child health, libraries, and recreation facilities. The other thing is that most councils are struggling for funds, and we don't hold that mandate on homelessness response, as I mentioned before. So through my fellowship, I collected a whole bunch of ideas, tips, stories, and resources about how local government can drive and steer homelessness response efforts. And if you look through my fellowship report, and you can use that QR code there on your screen to pick it up, or those will come through as well, you'll see that I brought together what I learned and heard into a set of guidelines. And these group what I see as potential local government responses under 4 key areas. So the first is knowing your homelessness situation. The second is leading the narrative and driving collaboration. The third is organising your approach and your workforce. And the last is acting wherever you can. So I'm just going to really quickly take you through some of those now. So the first was to know your homelessness situation. And this is David from a great organisation in the UK called World Habitat. And he had a lot to tell me about why you need to know your community. He said, if you have data, then you know your situation. He said, when you have information, you shift from thinking about whether you should do something to actually doing it. And my report goes into many ways that councils can get to know its homelessness situation and why that's important. And the Built for Zero, Advanced to Zero methodology has definitely covered that. And David has covered that in detail in his report too, so which is great. In addition, I'll just mention here the important role that councils can play in setting homelessness strategy and bringing many groups together. So here's an example. Manchester Council in the UK was a real standout in this sense. They were forming strong and deep connections with their local community. And they've listened and learned and invited local partners to work with them. And much of their strategic decision-making regarding homelessness in Manchester is made through the Manchester Homelessness Partnership, which is a network of businesses, government, charities, and volunteer organisations, as well as people with a lived experience of homelessness. And that local partnership manages homelessness response on many fronts, including taking the responsibility for writing Manchester City's homelessness strategy. And those strategies are quite often the responsibility of a local government council to do. And actually the team at the City of Manchester wisely pointed out to me that if the community own the strategy, then they can't really blame the council. That's certainly one way to look at it, I think. My second broad observation is that local government's in a unique position to lead the narrative and drive collaboration. And this is Jocelyn Carter, who's the administrator of the New York Department of Homelessness. She basically runs the show there, but she also prioritises her time in talking to local communities about the local homelessness situation and the needs of people experiencing homelessness. That's not below her at her level, that's a fundamental part of her job. So while things are different here in Australia, our responsibilities are different, there's a lot that local government can do to nurture and build alliances and to work with community, including people with the lived experience, and also change the narrative about homelessness. This is where organisations like Urban Alchemy in San Francisco, I think, are doing really amazing things. And this responds to the deep conflict that local government often faces when homelessness becomes an issue about safety and amenity, and when conversations turn to cleaning things up. Urban Alchemy works with the San Francisco government, and it's a great example of how one initiative can achieve many outcomes, focusing on safety and amenity, changing community attitudes, and also job creation. So at the top right of this slide, you'll see, oops, I think I've just gone forward. Let me go back. There we go. At the top right of this slide, you'll see Bayron Wilson and Leanne Miller. They both grew up in the same San Francisco neighborhood. Leanne went to university and ended up earning a PhD in psychology, and Bayron served a long sentence in jail. And together they formed Urban Alchemy. And their initiative captures the knowledge and the skills of people who've served life sentences, who come out of prison with relatively few opportunities available to them, but often have education, emotional intelligence, and an ability to work with traumatized people and places. And I saw Urban Alchemy operating in the Tenderloin area of San Francisco, where they were contracted by the city to deliver community engagement and outreach services. And you can see them in the photo here to the left. I saw few security guards and a really low police presence in that Tenderloin area, but a lot of Urban Alchemy workers. And they were not offering security or social support services, but they were kind of a presence just there for anyone who needed them. And I felt like that changed the dynamics really significantly. If any of our Australian colleagues here today saw the Four Corners report very recently about the City of Darwin's use of private security firms, you might agree that this kind of approach could be a welcome alternative here too. And just note that a few of us are exploring that right now. So if you're interested, I'd really encourage you to get in touch as well. Third up, councils can achieve a lot by organising their approach and their workforces, and co-designing collaborative strategies that set goals and drive efforts is an effective tool that local government can lead. Also, we shouldn't underestimate the important roles that mayors, councillors and city or municipal management teams play. And the quote on this screen is a really bold observation, I think. Beth runs a highly influential housing not-for-profit in San Francisco, and she spoke candidly to me about how important leadership is from the top in setting the agenda and effectively influencing a community. Councils have an incredible amount of power to influence homelessness outcomes in either direction, and individual councillors often feel the pressure from community and want to show action and change, and that can often put them in a really difficult situation. The fourth and last action that I'll cover today is about local government taking action to prevent and end homelessness. And while they're often seen as the most important intervention of all, homelessness prevention methods are often hard to identify and measure in a local government context. But on this slide, you can see Neil Munslow, and he manages the homelessness work at Newcastle Council in the UK. And David did mention that there's quite a lot of good work coming out of the UK on prevention. And I think Neil's nailed it better than almost everyone. Their active inclusion Newcastle prevention work's drawn lots of interest and won them international awards as well. It's based on proactive partnerships across council and in the community, providing lots of support and information. And what the team does there is they focus on trigger points. So they support staff across their organisation to identify the risks of homelessness and know what to do. And the team provides targeted specialist advice to colleagues within the council, so on key issues like housing, debt and welfare. And they also offer crisis support activities like emergency food, gas, electricity and clothing. And I must say that I finished this fellowship really convinced that this is the space where councils can have the greatest impact of all. We just need the time and opportunity to work across our organisations and put this in place. And I'd really like to call out also a team in San Francisco in the San Francisco Library, Leah Esquera and her team, who do amazing work with as a social worker in the library, sort of using that connection point to actually connect in with community and really make differences in homelessness. The social work and library programs are really gaining a lot of traction here now in Australia based on the work that Leah sort of started up there 15 years ago. So it's a really exciting place to be. I'm going to finish off here with 5 big steps that I think local government can take towards ending homelessness. I won't go through them right now, but you can read about them in my report in more detail. And I'll just finish off here again with the report. You can use that QR code or go to look me up on the Churchill Trust website, and please feel free to get in touch. just going to work out how to stop sharing my screen now, which might take me a little bit to do. And there we go. We'll stop that share. There we go. Thank you very much, everyone.
So thank you, David and Leanne, for a wonderful presentations. And a common theme that is running through all of those presentations was it's a whole of community response that's required. So now the more that we continue to run these kind of webinars, and thank you to the Rough Institute of Global Homelessness and the Australian Alliance for running this webinar today, and for all of you, because it is this collective response from hearing this information, seeing this information, and how you can contribute in your own little way, and joining the dots and making sure that this is a movement. This is an Australian movement. This is a global movement to focus on truly ending homelessness, which as a human right, the right to housing, we've allowed this to go on globally for far too long. So there are a few questions coming up in the question and answer now, one in particular from Robert White, who says Glasgow benefits from Scottish Government that are aligned with the aspiration to have rare, brief and non-reoccurrent instances of homelessness. David and Leanne, what is your advice on engaging local, state or federal governments? And I suppose that would really be appropriate for you, Leanne.
I can jump in quickly, Al. Thanks, Robert. I think that, our biggest opportunity right now is really, I think, on the National Housing and Homelessness Plan and looking at how we can influence that. And from a local government perspective, we really need recognition of local government. It's really that the funding that happens right now is between the federal and state governments. The difficulty for local government often in getting involved in homelessness is the fact that we don't have the money to get involved. So even small amounts of funding, say $100,000, could make the difference between a council actually taking action on homelessness or doing nothing at all and saying it's not their responsibility. So I think some thought about the funding mechanisms so that local government can take a role, and then, sort of support to be able to understand what the best outcomes are and what the best actions are, a bit of training on that front as well. At least that's from the local government perspective.
Thank you, Leanne. And David, would you like to add any comment there?
Yeah, obviously I agree with Leanne on that. I think that from a federal government and a state government perspective, I would say clarity and strategy, like from the sector going to government with a clear strategy and a clear consistent asks to government, state and federal and even local, and clear data on what the need is a really helpful part of that. And I think having public dashboards that tell you exactly how much homelessness there is and saying there's a role for each level of government to be involved in that, I think is really helpful. But I also think is like bringing the diverse voices with you when you're having those conversations. So like if you go to the federal government or state government, bringing local government with you because they hold the problem, whereas the state government has the responsibility and the federal government has all the money, is the sort of, line that Leanne and I heard a number of times. But essentially, if you go to different levels of government, bringing the other level of government with you, that's helpful. But also the diverse voices of business and faith groups and those sorts of things, saying the same thing that we're trying to say. Make the economic case with the business groups, make the moral case with the faith-based groups, and make sure the case is aligned to a clear strategy. Because a lot of the time people are involved in this problem and we're all pulling in slightly different directions. Some of us are providing charity and some of us are trying to end homelessness. And there's a very important role for charity in addressing crisis and need. But actually, if you want to solve the problem, that can't be the only thing we do. And we've got to get people aligned around what the strategy is, that ending homelessness is even possible.
Thank you, David. How can homelessness and health be more interconnected? And how much is healthcare accessible for people facing homelessness? And I'll go with you first, David, if You've got a response to that at all?
Well, I mean, my initial reaction has been to really focus on the crisis end. So even though the general approach of Advance to Zero and the things that I've been involved in is take a sort of strength-based approach to our advocacy and other things, on the health side of things, I feel like there is a very clear sign of the system failing, and that is, 420 odd people dying each year, more than half of which from preventable illnesses. That is a health crisis as much as it is as a housing crisis or anything else. And so we've got to make that case, and we've got to share the data on it. We've got to make that invisible issue transparent. And one of the things that I saw that worked really well on that was The Guardian in the UK ran a whole series about homelessness deaths. And I'm really happy that we've been able to get The Guardian in Australia. They're going to run a similar series in Australia, profiling what happens when people die whilst experiencing homelessness. Because that actually shocks the community when they hear about it. And, in Canada, one of the things that really led to a lot of change was a person experiencing homelessness froze to death on the steps of Parliament in Ottawa. And that led to a lot of change. And so these kinds of tragedies are happening in Australia all the time. And I think we've got to find a way to respectfully elevate that. And I think there's a challenge to that, because a lot of the people who are prematurely dying are First Nations. And there's some challenges around sorry business and around sharing those stories and talking about it. And there's also challenges in terms of racism and the rest of it. But I think, anyway, highlighting the crisis end of the health part, I think is probably a good way to try and address that.
And Leanne, a question from Howard Raleigh here. Did you see any compelling examples of challenging the stigma? Did Glasgow worry about this issue? Or probably David, I know you spent quite a lot of time in Glasgow. It is an important theory of change. So I'll go to you first, Leanne, but I know that you might have some comments on that as well, David.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, from a local government perspective, I've thought a bit about what we can do to help change attitudes and challenge stigmas. And there is actually some very good work coming out of Crisis in the organisation in the UK that looks at framing homelessness and about how we talk about the homelessness situation, because it is one of those situations where people do really, they see it, they know it, they have often very particular ideas about it, but it's so complex that individual situations are so different that it requires a form of nuanced communication that is a bit more than we normally do. But from a local government perspective, I kept hearing about the power of your councillors and your mayors in driving that the narrative, because councils are in a much stronger position than the state and federal government as being right there on the ground and able to have be able to communicate very closely with people. And, I think it's really important that councils jump up and sort of take that position and bust some of those myths. And there are some really great, ways that can be done. I mean, it can be done through frontline workers like, librarians or maternal and child health nurses. If they know a bit about the situation, they can talk to people and they're trusted people in the community. It could happen through, a lot of councils have theatre and arts, and it could happen through arts. It can happen through many different ways, but we have to be a little bit more creative about that and really take it seriously and actually prioritise it, because what happens is often you're too busy doing all your work and you don't think about actually getting the message out.
Yeah, what I'd add to that is I think that we're part of the problem, the homelessness service system sometimes, is that the way in which we communicate this problem reinforces a negative stereotype and perception, and the way in which we fundraise, and there's a reason for that, we're underfunded, but the crisis-driven nature of how we fundraise is negatively reinforcing stereotypes around homelessness as a choice and other things, and that all homelessness is rough sleeping, which we know it's not. But so anyway, there's some really great work that I saw in around the way in which we can better frame and talk about homelessness. But I think the best way of tackling stigma is actually by elevating lived experience voices. That when you have people with lived experience telling their stories, this idea that homelessness is a choice really gets dispelled pretty quickly. And, you know, one of the best phrases that I heard from someone with experience said, if homelessness is a choice, why do no rich people choose it? You know, it's not a choice. It's the only choice element of homelessness is that it's the choice of society to allow this problem to continue. And the best voices for helping to tackle that stigma are lived experience. And so elevating those voices and making sure they're a bigger part of the narrative, I think, was one of the best ways I saw that. And homelessness agencies recognizing that, you know, having images of generally a male with a brown paper bag on a street corner, that's not a good image to reinforce what an end to homelessness looks like, which ought to be our strategy and goal. It needs to be much more about people in housing and the solutions, and that we're not creating the despondency and the despair around this issue that, you know, it's not working. We've been trying it for a very long time.
Thank you, David and Leanne. I'm just going to cut to Tiffany. How are we going for time, Tiffany? And I know that many of our attendees today are in different time zones, so
Yes.
how are we?
I think we were scheduled to end about 10 minutes, so we're about 10 minutes over now. I'm not sure. I don't think there's a ton of other questions submitted.
Just one about youth homelessness. Again, that could be, you know, a topic all of its own, but maybe we'll just quickly throw it out there. Those who have to leave, we understand. But if you do wish to stay around and listen to these two wonderful fellows continue to impart their knowledge gained from most of you. I've seen a lot of people in the chat there, you know, saying hi to David and Leanne because, you know, they did host them in their particular cities all over the world. So, but if you have to leave, then leave. But this last one, youth homelessness often presents itself differently, that regular experiences of homelessness, in and out of home, engagement, hidden forms of homelessness. How will or should these differences be addressed? And to either of you, given the lateness of this.
If you like. I mean, I think the prevention point that we've both highlighted is so important, and the best form of ending homelessness is prevention, and the best place to start prevention is early and young people, and let's stop the next generation of people experiencing homelessness. So I think more work around prevention, more investment in prevention is absolutely needed. From a reflection from the AEH's perspective, like whilst we largely focus on the sort of rough sleeping, chronic homelessness kind of side of things, I did have the opportunity to experience how the sort of Built for Zero, Advanced to Zero kind of work has been applied in relation to youth. And that was really impressive to see. It just hasn't been sort of like invested in the Australian context. But there is some really great examples of youth prevention in Australia, in Geelong, for example, that a number of people when I was around the world talked about. So it can happen. It does happen here. It just needs more government investment, if you ask me.
Wonderful. And closing comments, Leanne?
Yeah, I think it just goes back. I agree with David. It goes back to that prevention side. And again, sort of from a local government perspective, really looking at what those touch points are in, because you do have professionals like maternal and child health, youth workers, you have people working in playgroups in other places who can see those triggers into homelessness. And if we help those people who don't have homelessness in their job title or their position description, but still have a really important role to play, if we can involve them, that's really the whole concept of making homelessness everybody's business. And I think that works particularly in that sort of early indication of youth and child homelessness in particular.
So thank you everybody. I'm just had a little special shout out to do for Ashley and Dasha at the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness for their work, alongside my fellow namesake Tiffany Connolly from the Rough Institute of Global Homelessness. It's been wonderful hearing all of you, meeting so many people in my role as co-chair, in my continued activity in lived experience workshops, and to know that there is so many people pulling towards the ending of homelessness. That narrative, ending homelessness, maybe 5 years ago, unbelievable. Now it's certainly a narrative that can be carried forward as one proof point after another proof point happens. So thank you very much, Leanne, David. Thank you again to the Rough Institute of Global Homelessness and to the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness. My name's Allan Big Al Connolly. I look forward to seeing you again on another webinar very soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Hey, well done, guys. Nice work, Al. Thanks, Tiffany.
Thank you. That was wonderful.